She was on her knees in the mud before the ink on the deed was even dry. 11 acres, dead land, a barn that was one storm away from collapsing, and a single mother of four had just handed over every dollar of savings she had left for it. The neighbors didn't just think she'd made a mistake. They were certain of it. Some of them even placed bets on how long before the bank took it back. But Dana Whitfield wasn't looking at what the land was. She was digging, literally with her bare hands, for what it used to be, and 2 inches beneath soil that hadn't grown a single green thing in 8 years. Her fingers stopped moving. She'd found something. Something the last 4 people who'd walked that field had missed completely. She told no one. Not her kids. Not the bank. Not the man who pulled up beside her fence a week later just to laugh in her face. 8 months from that morning, that same man would stand at the edge of her field, take his hat off, and not say a single word. We're going to tell you exactly what she found and exactly what she did with it. But first, if stories about people who get quietly, completely underestimated are the reason you're here, hit subscribe now, because this channel lives for exactly this. Drop where you're watching from the comments. We read every one. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the morning nobody thought was worth watching. Dana Whitfield was 38 years old, raising 4 kids alone in a rented house outside Morgantown, West Virginia. Her husband had walked out 6 years earlier, a note on the kitchen table, a truck loan still sitting in her name. She worked overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse and did freelance bookkeeping for 2 small businesses in whatever hours were left over. Her oldest, Jonah, was 15 and already talking about quitting school to work full-time, which frightened her more than any bill ever had. The twins, Ellie and Sam, were 11. Her youngest, Willa, was 6 and asked why about everything, a habit Dana secretly loved, even on the night she was too tired to answer it. Money in that house wasn't a crisis. It was a low, constant hum, never loud enough to be an emergency, never quiet enough to let her rest. People who didn't know Dana mistook her calm for coldness. In truth, she just handled problems differently. She sat with them, turned them over slowly, looked at them from angles other people didn't bother with. She kept a green spiral notebook in her bag for exactly this, a habit older than her twins. She wasn't looking for a farm. She was scrolling foreclosure listings out of habit, the way tired people scroll things they have no business scrolling at 1 a.m. And there was, buried on page 4, 11 acres sold as is significant restoration required. One photograph, taken from a moving car. It looked every bit as bad as that sounds. She drove out alone on a Sunday and told no one where she was going. The front 2 acres had clearly been farmed once. She could tell by the shape of the ground beneath the weeds. The back half was a wall of ragweed and bindweed taller than her shoulders. A rusted hay rake sat sinking into the mud by the barn itself groaned every time the wind caught it wrong. A stock pond at the low end had gone green and still. She broke off a fence rail and dug into ground near the gate. The top inch of soil was pale hard, almost like concrete. But 2 inches down, everything changed, darker, cooler, alive. She dug further and found one earthworm, moving slow and unbothered to ground the whole county had already declared dead. She walked the property for 2 hours that day, checked the slope of the land, checked where water pooled and where it didn't, noticed what survived along the fence line without anyone's help. A long tangle of wild vetch, climbing to the grass in ropes of purple. To most people, that was just a weed. To Dana, it was a clue. The ground wasn't ruined. It was starved. And starved was a problem she understood, because she'd been managing something almost identical in her own kitchen for 6 years. She made an offer before she even drove home. News like that travels fast on a road with 11 houses. By the following Saturday, Roy Ackerman, who'd farmed the land 2 doors down for nearly 40 years, slowed his truck in front of the field, stared a long moment, and kept driving without stopping. 2 days later at the feed store, he told the room she paid full asking for that ground. I wouldn't take it as a gift. A couple of men laughed. One said the weeds alone would cost more to clear than the whole property was worth. A woman named Carol, from the bend in the road, told her husband she felt sorry for those kids, in the tone people use when they want cruelty to sound like sympathy. And one Tuesday, while Dana walked the fence line with Jonah beside her, a stranger slowed his truck at the gate and called out, "Nothing's grown on that dirt in 8 years. You know that, right?" He glanced at Jonah, 15 years old, holding a roll of fence wire while his mother wrote in her notebook, and drove off with a short laugh. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He just couldn't picture a version of this that ended well. Jonah watched his mother's face as the truck pulled away. She didn't answer him. She just nodded once, almost to herself, and turned back to fence. But what Dana Whitfield already had planned for that ground worked out in the corner of a green spiral notebook long before she'd signed a single paper. Wasn't anything Roy Ackerman or Carol at the bend in the road could have seen coming. The first thing Dana planted on that field wasn't anything she could sell. It wasn't anything she could even show her kids and call progress. That October, she seeded the front 2 acres in both fence-line strips with a mix of crimson clover, hairy vetch, and winter rye. Nothing on that list would end up on a dinner plate or in a farmer's market crate. Jonah stood at the edge of the field with his arms crossed, watching his mother plant seed into ground they weren't going to harvest, and finally asked her straight out, "Why are we planting something we can't eat?" Dana told him the truth. The soil had been stripped bare. Years of neglect had left it thin, lifeless, unable to support anything worth growing. You couldn't force a real crop out of exhausted ground just because you needed the money badly enough. The land had to be rebuilt first. Cover crops weren't there to feed a family. They were there to feed the dirt. Winter ride to hold the soil against wind and runoff. Clover and vetch to pull nitrogen out of the air and feed it back into ground through their roots. It was slow, invisible work, but it was the only work that would actually matter later. What the neighbors didn't know was that this was only step 1. February brought 3 days of hard, sideways rain. The low corner of the field, the same corner Dana had walked and studied for 2 hours that first Sunday, flooded completely. When the water finally receded, a whole strip of newly rooted cover crop had washed out, leaving a raw, muddy scar across ground she spent 2 full weekends working by hand. She found it on a Thursday morning before a shift. She stood at the edge of it for a long time, saying nothing. Roy Ackerman drove past that same morning and saw it from the road. By Friday, he was back at the feed store. "Lost the whole low end," he told the man at the counter. "Told my wife that ground never drained right. Never will." What he didn't see was what happened that weekend. Dana and Jonah, working with shovels in the cold, built a shallow earthen berm along the low edge to redirect the runoff before it ever reached the planted section again. She reseeded the washed-out strip, then covered it with old hay from the barn, pressing it down by hand so it wouldn't blow off in the wind. Then she did the only thing left to do. She waited. She didn't know if it would take. She'd read everything she could find on soil recovery and drainage and timing, but reading about it in a library chair and standing ankle-deep in February mud with 4 kids depending on her were 2 very different kinds of knowing. 3 weeks later, the reseeded strip came up green. By late April, the whole field had changed. Clover ran thick and low along the fence lines, white and crimson flowers threaded through it. The vetch had climbed the old rusted wire, burying it under purple. The rye stood tall and dark across the front section, bending in waves whenever the wind moved through it. It didn't look like a wreck of a property anymore. It looked like something was happening there. A pair of barn swallows moved into the hole in the roof. Ground beetles turned up in the soil, a sign of recovery Dana had read about and had been quietly checking for every week. The twins had taken over parts of the record-keeping without being asked. Sam counted earthworms in 3 different spots each Sunday and reported back like it was breaking news. Ellie started drawing her own map of the field in a school notebook, marking which sections were coming back fastest. Willa's job was simpler. She got to say what color the dirt was that week, and she took it very seriously. Carol, from a bend in the road, stopped by the fence one evening in May. "It doesn't look quite as bad out here," she said carefully. Dana just smiled and said it was getting there. What she didn't mention was that she'd already placed an order 2 weeks earlier for something the neighbors had never seen anyone plant in that county before. That same fall, once the cover crop had done its work and been turned back into the soil, Dana and all 4 kids knelt in the dirt and planted saffron crocus bulbs. Over 3,000 of them, hand-tucked into rows across the restored front section. Not a crop anyone in Belmont County had ever grown. not a crop most people had ever seen growing anywhere outside a spice jar. Saffron doesn't need rich, heavy ground. It actually prefers the opposite: well-drained, lean soil, the kind that would kill most vegetable crops, but suits a corn that's been surviving in poor Mediterranean hillsides for thousands of years. What it needed from Dana's field wasn't fertility in the traditional sense. It needed structure, drainage, soil that could breathe, exactly what 8 months of cover cropping had just spent building. And saffron sells for more per ounce than gold. A single acre, properly managed, can produce a crop worth more than 10 acres of corn. Dana had done the math in her spiral notebook months before a single bulb went into the ground. She didn't need 100 acres. She needed one carefully rebuilt field, and a crop that matched the size of what she actually had. The neighbors didn't notice anything all summer. Saffron crocus stays dormant through the warm months. Nothing to see, nothing to laugh at, nothing to report back at the feed store. Then, in the third week of October, almost overnight, the field exploded into thousands of small purple flowers, each one holding 3 thread-thin crimson stigmas at its center, the part worth more than gold. Dana and the kids harvested at dawn for 11 straight days, because the flowers had to be picked before the sun opened them fully and before the heat degraded the threads inside. Willa carried a small basket. Ellie and Sam worked 2 rows at a time, racing each other without meaning to. Jonah worked the far end alone, quiet, focused, pulling blossoms as fast as his hands would move. Roy Ackerman drove past on 11 morning and, for the first time in a year, actually pulled into the drive. He stood at the edge of the field for a long moment, watching a woman and her 4 kids moving through rows of purple flowers that had, 3 seasons earlier, been ground he'd sworn couldn't grow a weed properly. He took his hat off. "Never seen anything like this out here," he said. "What in the world is this?" Dana straightened up, a basket of blossoms on her hip. "Saffron," she said. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the soil, darker now, looser, alive in a way he recognized even if he'd never worked with a crop like this himself. How'd you get anything to grow on that ground? It was nothing when you bought it. Dana thought about it for a second. "I stopped asking what I could take out of it," she said, "and started asking what it needed put back in." Roy Ackerman didn't have a clever answer for that. He just stood there, a man who'd farmed that road for almost 40 years, looking at a field that had just taught him something he never expected to learn from the woman he'd laughed about at the feed store. The dried saffron sold that winter to 3 restaurants in Morgantown and a specialty grocer 2 counties over, at a price per ounce that still didn't feel real when Dana wrote it down in her notebook. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady, it was real, and it had come out of ground that every single person on that road had already buried in their minds. Willa still tracks the dirt's color every week, in her own handwriting now. Sam still counts earthworms on Sundays and still treats it like the most important job on the farm. Ellie's field map has 3 years of notes on it now, and she's already planning where to expand next season. Jonah, who once asked why they were planting something they couldn't harvest, spends his evenings researching which specialty crops might come next. That field on Route 9 sat written off for 8 years because everyone who looked at it only saw what it currently was: pale, cracked, exhausted, done. Dana Whitfield knelt down in the middle of it and asked a different question. Not what is this, but what could this still become, and what would it take to get there? The ground wasn't ruined. It was just tired of being asked to give without ever being given anything back. And when someone finally knelt down long enough to notice what it needed, it answered her,